More. Woo! Yeah, woo! Awesome. What a wonderful thing to see a very, very full house here. My name's Jorge Amigo. Welcome to the Alice Mackay Room. I'm the head of cultural programming here at the Vancouver Public Library. And it's wonderful to have you here for yet another exciting Incite event. We're very grateful to the Vancouver Writers Festival for this partnership, which brings the most exciting writers right here to your library. Now, before we begin, I want to acknowledge we're hosting this event from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. It's a little tinny, so I'm going to wait for, can you lower the gain or the level? Yeah. I'm going to say that again. I want to acknowledge that we're hosting this event from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I'm a settler in these lands, which means I have a responsibility to continually learn about the ongoing effects of colonialism in this part of the world, and to do my part as a public servant to bring that awareness into my work. And speaking of learning, so as I was saying, speaking of learning, earlier this year, I read the Yellowhead Institute's report on Canada's progress and reconciliation. And who here has read this report or has heard of the Yellowhead Institute? Okay, a third of you, wonderful. So as you may remember, in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released 94 calls to action, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau personally promised to implement them fully. How do you think we're doing with that? Okay. So after 8 years, only 13 of the 94 calls to action have been completed since 2015, and 0 calls to action were completed last year in 2023. That is a completion rate of less than 2 calls to action per year, which means that if Canada continues at this pace, it'll take another 58 years until the calls to action are completed, so Indigenous peoples will have to wait until 2081 for reconciliation. Now, as you can imagine, that report concludes that Canada is not serious about reconciliation. So I want to read you one quote from that report who I think summarizes what's at stake. I'm going to quote, "To our minds, the only way to breathe life back into the conversation on reconciliation would be for Canada to first accept the truth that there are too many systems still in place that actively harm Indigenous peoples, particularly the most vulnerable. Accepting this truth exposes any notion of simply repairing the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canadians for what it is, pure fantasy. Real and meaningful transformative change to underlying systems of oppression is required, not just individual tinkering around the edges of a broken colonial machine." So I say this because I think that a land acknowledgement is only meaningful if it leads to some form of action or fires you up to do something. So the one action I want you to take from this is go read that report. I think reading that report will be enough for you to know what's at stake, to understand how we're failing, why we're failing, and the ongoing impact that that has on our society. Okay, so let's get into some housekeeping notes and get this started. So a quick show of hands, who is here for the very first Incite event ever? Okay. And who has already come to a previous event in this season, Incite? Okay, awesome. So most of you are regulars. So before I pass it on to Leslie, I have a few reminders for you. The first reminder is that I want you to exit through the back doors. That's the exit. If you need to leave the room, this exit obviously is an exit, but it's very loud for the people on stage, so try not to use that one. Exit through the back door. You can re-enter anytime. We're not the ballet, it's not the Queen Elizabeth Theatre. Now the washrooms are located right outside this room to the right, so they're over there. And then very important one, because we're gonna have some poetry reading here, your cell phones. You have these things in your pocket that make a lot of noise sometimes. I know some of us have alarms at 7:30 to feed our cats. And even if our phones are silent, the alarm still goes off. So make sure you look to see that you don't have any alarms to feed your cat and turn them off. And make sure that your phones are not making noise. You can take your phone out during the event and take pictures and videos. We love that. Actually, tag us, tag the Writers Festival, tell the world you're at a cool library event. that's it from me. It's my pleasure now to pass the torch to Leslie Hurtig, who is the Artistic Director of the Vancouver Writers Festival.
Thank you so much, Jorge, and good evening to all of you, and welcome to Incite. Hello to all of you watching from home as well. The Vancouver Writers Fest has had the opportunity to present Michael Ondaatje with new works at the festival and in special events over the course of his decorated career. And it was with great excitement we learned of this new collection of poetry, his first in many years, A Year of Last Things. And we jumped at the chance to present him at our Incite series as part of our free and accessible programming. Tonight, we are very grateful to our Incite partners, the Vancouver Public Library, for their collaboration and this space to gather in. Thanks also to our government sponsors, which include the Government of Canada, the BC Government, the Canada Council for the Arts, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island. And I'd also like to thank Penguin Random House Canada for making Michael's visit to Vancouver possible. For those of you who are new to Incite, as Jorge said, the Vancouver Writers Fest and VPL present this series until the end of May, just about every other Wednesday, and we update our website regularly so you can check out what's coming up soon. In a few moments, I will be welcoming Michael and our host, Jenny Penberthy, to the stage. Michael will be reading from A Year of Last Things before sitting down with Jenny for a conversation. Towards the end of our evening, Jenny will be turning things over to you, our audience here, as well as our viewers at home, to ask a few questions of your own. She'll have time to take just a handful of those before Michael will return to the podium to read just a bit more from his collection and then bid you all a good night. But the good news is he took the time to sign all of this wonderful stock over here. These are all signed copies of the brand new book, and we hope you'll take the time to go and visit Marianne at the Book Warehouse table and pick up a copy of this extraordinary collection. And now please let me introduce our guests. Jenny Penberthy is a former editor of the Capilano Review and the author of several works related to American poet Lorraine Niedecker, with whom Jenny and Michael Ondaatje share an affinity. And our special guest. As The Guardian recently said, Michael Ondaatje has always been a poet. It's how he began his career 50 years ago, and his collections have been awarded Governor General's Awards, among other things. He is perhaps even more famous as a novelist, especially for his 1992 Booker Prize winning The English Patient, which also won the Golden Man Booker in 2018, and his highly awarded novel Anil's Ghost, just to name a couple. But poetry is infused throughout his 7 novels and a work of memoir, and it comes as little surprise that this, his new collection, A Year of Last Things, is being called the work of a mature poet at the zenith of his talent. The Quill Quire went further to say, A Year of Last Things is a collection that bears multiple and complex readings. It is Ondaatje's finest. Here to read from his new collection, please welcome Michael Ondaatje and Jenny Penberthy.
So I'm going to read for a while, and then Jenny and I are going to talk about books, I guess, and poetry. This is called Locke. Reading the lines he loves, he slips them into a pocket, wishes to die with his clothes full of torn free stanzas and the telephone numbers of his children in far cities. As if these were all we need and want, not the dog or silver bowl, not the brag of career or ownership. Unless they can be used, a bowl to beg with, a howl to scent a friend, as those torn lines remind us how to recall. Until we reach the horizon and drop or rise like a canoe within a lock to search the other half of the river, where you might see your friends as altered by this Incite, as altered by this altitude as you. The fresh summer grass, the smell of the view, dark water, August paint. How I loved that lock when I saw it all those summers ago. Dark water, how I loved it all those summers ago, when we arrived out of a storm into its evening light and gave a stranger some wine in a tin cup. Even then I wanted to slip into the wet, dark rectangle and swim on, barefoot, to other depths, where nothing could be seen. That was a further story. Dark garden. What was the month you stepped barefooted, a rabbit's cage fallen open on the grass below your gaze, onto a nail? A winter month in the tropics. One of your daughters recently born. This is all I know of the story. Not your gasp or the half collapse, whatever that month was, or even the year. Where was I in the late 60s? Somewhere in the middle of a book, a Western with distant violence and Sally Chisholm stepping barefoot onto a porch with Billy to pull a splinter out of her heel. That faraway echo and coincidence. So I did not hear the gasp, see her stillness or her unheld in that dark garden. During the collapse of everything, a marriage, no ointment in the house, the children unawakened, unaware on that December or perhaps April night when the darkness took forever to die. Where is that unmarked calendar for 1969, when she cleaned her blood off the mat floor, a single mother in those missed years, with only the small glimmer of possibility or luck, still years away from us. Is the sound okay? Okay, thank you. This book jumps back and forward into youth, into a later age, etc. So it's a bit of a collage of time. 5 a.m. for Stan Ragland and Chris Coleman. The wilderness of our youth, an empty barn, dancing with friends into the small hours, then daylight, and the cars swerving away, wordless, into the dawn. It arrives all at once tonight, not as memory, but like a gift from forgetfulness, as a desire can wake you, or this poem based on the accidental change of speed in a friend's camera into slow motion. So now I remember the rest of our shadows as we danced, all our heartbeats under the thunder. And I can speak to you the way we once sang farewells out of our cars late at night, when those goodbyes remembered everything. This poem grew out of reading or attempting to read a Sanskrit dictionary. So that's how it grew anyway. And it's called Definition. All afternoon I strolled the plotless 1,300 pages of a Sanskrit dictionary, with its verbs for holy obsessions, the name for an alcove of coin washers, whose fingers glint all night with dark lead, grains of silver. Here root vowels take an accent at high altitudes, the way dictionaries speak over mountains, a single word to portray from that distant village reflected in a cloud, or your lover's face lit by the moonlight on a stage. Landscapes nudge the dialect. In far places, travelers know a faint gesture can mean desire or scorn, just as a sliver of a phrase thrown away hides charms within its grammar. A guru, someone with a light touch, derives from that short vowel alone and before a single consonant. Wherever you turn, definitions push open a door. The precisely named odor of a man who is a heart thief, a word for the highest complication during a play used also for impregnation. Attributes of character link themselves to professions: a metal worker, the river merchant, the commissioner of oaths, the census taker of birds who continues the medieval art of whistling, those who carry bees on their arms like a dark flame, the sullen recluse who was once the author of a prayer, this word for a pool beside a temple, or answer, the shape of a shoulder blade, as in the corner of a holy quadrangle. The ancient phrases give you the coin of escape, that epithet for those who return to broken relationships repeatedly, will row you away from confusion, or remain only for remembrance. This is how deep I was lost, my darling, in a love so narcotic I possessed unimpaired splendor, having no other want or wish. What was there before there was the warmth of that word for your shoulder blade, or that time before we moved to a freedom from desire? Two photographs. It was years earlier, you in an old bathtub with barely a few inches of water, on an island, the weather outside unknown, but for the tan that surrounded your whiteness. Everything suggested an era long before the present, the late 60s perhaps, a weekday afternoon, with little to show how you spent your days, your nights. Just two black and white photographs, the first capturing your gaze into nowhere, the other when you covered your face with your hands so you were not anonymous, only unseen, except perhaps by what you might be thinking. What was the year? Where was the house and town? Nothing given away by your silence and careful movement, still practically a bride, 20 years before we met. Another photograph I saw later, a more formal nude shaped by shadow, your bare feet, you in a crouch, faceless, not so much your image, but a husband's hovering with a camera. Whereas everything casual in the earlier pictures, with that bathtub and raw sunlight, make them your ex-husband's masterpiece. The secret of your look, the recall of an afternoon when things might hold or fall away. It is in these pictures, being the unknown stranger, I hold a complete belief in you long before we met. How did we meet? I whisper even now, as if magically that first time landing after a far journey upon a dark, hardly lit island late at night, and then somehow solitary with you in what, for all I knew, was a crowded car. Wanderer. Let us speak about our enormous flaws, as told to us by others, accountants, wives before leaving, about how we deceived ourselves, even our dogs, by ignoring their constant concerned. Sorry, I'll start again. Let us speak about our enormous flaws, as told to us by others, accountants, wives before leaving, about those we deceived and how we deceived ourselves, even our dogs, by ignoring their concerned pre-walk, tear-strained howls, though they rested often on our chests, making sounds like old ships. But there is only, but always, a small tunnel of escape for forgiveness. As with any novel or film, you hang on to character rights and where you came from. There's not much to leave when you're only 15, we are told. My friend's family in Warsaw during the war was fed and kept alive by a German deserter who roamed Europe like Odysseus, even joining them in their escape, pretending to be mute while they taught him Polish. A dissolved genealogy let him cross borders and war zones with them, finding a path through various armies. He knew already the great engines of the world do not run on faithfulness. Without a homeland, he was for a while the father to these children. And later, more than once needing a passport, he married more than once. With dialects and port-accented verbs, he could sing in 4 languages about departure. He belonged still to himself at 15, waiting for the later years to reach him. Who had he become? He'd bunked beside Isaiah, escaped judgment, remained as if impenitent. He felt comforted only when, as with the dog, it became difficult to know if accusations meant damnation or contentment. I'm going to read a little bit of prose. The book suddenly slips or leaps into prose, and there's one poem set in Bulgaria which seems to go all over the place, and I'll just read the place where there's a bit of prose. One night at the village of Kopritsitska, where Miro and his father and I paused for a night on a journey west, we entered a barely lit dining room in a local inn, where the dial of the small radio lit up its various stations like a miniature firmament. We could hear what sounded like tentative confessions in varying languages. When Miro and his father went up to their rooms, I remained behind. Sometimes I would recognize a refrain or line from a poem. But most of what I heard was perhaps being attempted for the first time and sounded embarrassed. Every time I saw you, a man was saying, I was crazy about you. Even the time you came up to me in that bar and asked me to dance as the jukebox played Wild Horses, and I said no, even then I was crazy about you. A few minutes later, a female voice. Sometimes you don't want to love the person you love. You turn your face away from that face, whose eyes, lips might make you give up anger. The radio host gathered these calls from numerous cities without judgment, as if we all were, as a writer once said, anonymous among thousands, waiting in the dark at great stations on the edge of countries. I crouched by the black cube, broadcasting those excuses that once had rejected someone's desire. Perhaps it was too carefully protected relationship in that person, who now realized it had become with time an untruthful permanence. Perhaps the object of desire had feared the possibility of a capsizing life, but now a refusal felt worse than unfaithfulness, worse than trespass. The confessing voices continued to be broadcast on the radio on this radio station, as if their only intent was to reach just one person who might now perhaps whisper back to them through the darkness and alter a previously scared trespass on a night when he had touched her, but she would not touch him. Brighton girls are like the moon, a rough male voice was singing, as that evening of voices began gradually to be replaced by music. Now and then, I hear confessions like this in my own life. I've often listened to a friend who felt self-damned. And once there were 3 women I sat next to in a bar all evening in Haisela, Alberta, who complained of a mutual friend they had once been obsessed with, eventually singing "He was the first to entice me when I was young," again and again, until the words became a chanting when removed from their melody, making it stark judgment, a curse. I was aware of all this in the darkness of their room in Bulgaria, while outside the traffic of cars was transporting delicate objects wrapped in heavy cloth. The atmosphere was of some earlier decade. When the radio's volume began to fade, I pressed myself closer to the speaker to hear of someone who touched a woman's neck, so she had drawn back awkwardly, who might instead have paused and then returned to him slowly, so he could feel her heartbeat at his shirt. But now, they both were in this much later time, moths banging their bodies against any available light. The book has an element of collage in terms of time, and then as a result, I did write a couple that became sort of collages of memories as well. This is called a billiard hall, crest sandwiches, wallpaper, a piano solo. Beckett, they say, read his Bible for style. Stendhal, the Napoleonic Code. The Ames billiard hall in The Hustler during the first 35 minutes and again in the final scene. Or a slower duration of time during the ball in The Leopard and in the memory game in Days and Nights in the Forest. Picnics by Monet, Titian, the elder Bruegel, grand lunches in the Bois de Boulogne with concealed orchestras in a grove, or Ratty with Mole consuming cold chicken, ham, pickled gherkins, French rolls, cress sandwiches, ginger beer along their river. The wallpaper in Proust's bedroom, 1882, while he was a boy. Les Oignons by Sidney Bechet, Paris, 1949, shouted aloud as everybody danced. That piano version of The Man That Got Away by Bill Charlap you listened to, solitary at midnight, his slow, thoughtful chords defeating the great damned eloquence of the words. During those hours when we lose interest in what needs to be done. And I'll read one more poem and then we'll talk, I guess, and then I'll come back at the end. November. Where is my dear 16-year-old cat? I wish to carry upstairs in my arms, looking up at me and thinking, be careful, dear human. 16 years. How many days since I found you as if an urchin in a snowstorm, and you moved in, assured, learned the territories of the house and what became your garden. Only now do we see the horizon where you paused 2 or 3 times, then slipped into. Was it too soon or too late, that last summer of your life, when we watched your walk down to a river to take a sip from its ongoing flow. Oh, Jack, I miss your presence everywhere, in the corner of rooms, in every chair, or nesting in a cardboard box. Take me back where the past can again enter those early remembered rooms, our snowbound street. Lift me upside down in your arms. I cannot stand it. I need a journey too. Have I slept my life away? Do I understand anything? Will I wear a bell like yours in the afterlife where language no longer exists and we gather only linked sounds like oars from a passing boat? Those few syllables to recall tenderness. You no longer wait for us. All day long, Basho wrote, a lark sings in the air. Yet he seems to have had not quite his fill. Thank you. Okay.
Well, it's hard to say anything after those moving poems, especially that last one. I don't want to break the spell. Thank you for this extraordinary collection. These gorgeous, endlessly absorbing, moving poems about the past and its recovery via the very mixed access that memory offers. Yeah. All those small recalls of this and that, and the past reconstructed like a gift from forgetfulness. So The Year of Last Things, of course, is a collection compiled by an aging writer, but there's no posturing here, no trace of a coming of wisdom with time. Mm-hmm. Instead, you acknowledge the reality of forgetfulness and an imperfect memory. And yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk about the approach to recovering and representing the past via a patchy memory. Mm-hmm. And I know you talk about aids to memory and the lines or stanzas that you save in your pockets, and photographs.
I save photographs. I think that's more, I save photographs more than fragments of language, you know.
Yeah.
Thanks. And so that was, you know, I think when I was writing this book, I mean, first of all, I had to make this dangerous leap from prose to poetry. But I don't think I never really written fragments of a poem that then can be gathered together in a way. It's more like memory kind of invading a fragment of memory, invading you in various ways, talking to someone or remembering something someone said, or the thing with Stan Ragland and the leaving after a party at 2 a.m. or something like that. It's not a plotted thing, but you know it becomes plotted in the rewriting, I think, for me. Usually, I mean, practically every poem in this book was rewritten many times, so that you've kind of tried and present it in a different way to make it more natural, but also believable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, maybe you could talk about the first poem then, Locke, with you know, that opens with the scraps in your pocket and your children's phone numbers.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm kind of curious about the place of locks in, you know, the poems where there are several references to locks, and you know, I think you're a poet who doesn't doesn't use a great deal of metaphor. It's one of the intriguing things about your poetry. But I wonder about the use of lochs and also rivers,
Right.
both in your life and your writing. If you could talk about those.
Yeah, I mean, loch, again, is an example of something that I probably heard about 15 years ago on a canoe trip with friends and my children. And it really was like a 3-day trip, and then finally finding something that was, where you could go and, meet people and go on. And as I said earlier on, the book, when I put it together, turns into a kind of collage of time. And so when I don't know how many poems are in this book, 50, 40, something like that. And then when I had all the titles down, I realized that loch keeps coming up, So it became the first poem. It appears somewhere in the middle of the book, and it turns up in the last poem I write in this book. So that kind of gave me a kind of odd structure to it. It doesn't really mean anything, but it allowed me a kind of, A, B, and then Z. So that happened. And I think a lot of the poems in this book were replaced in a different way so that they could echo something else, or echo something at the beginning. So the first poem, Dark Garden, echoes later on with the bathtub poem and so forth. I don't know I think when I first wrote the collected works of Billy the Kid, which was a long time ago, and it was my first book where I began with poems and then suddenly had prose sequences and so forth. When I was teaching at the University of Western Ontario, I put all these first lines or first sections on the floor and then looked down and tried to find a structure that would make more sense than being a bit repetitive or a bit too familiar. So I think that going back, I remember that, and so in many ways, the structure of this is not based on time, but on memory.
I guess I'm sort of pushing towards some extra relevance to the lochs, and this opening poem with the strong title loch. And,
yeah.
But I don't think I'm getting anywhere with that.
No, I'm fascinated by lochs. I think the lochs come up in the last book to Wallite. There's a lot of lochs in that one, and
Right.
they're always fascinating to me. So, but nothing really profound about them, except there's a kind of death-like quality to that piece.
The piece, right. So, there's the raised elevation
Yes.
of the loch and the raised altitude, what is it? There's the altitude of friends, the shared altitude, and this is surely the altitude of age.
Yes, definitely age. Yeah.
Okay. And a horizon that's
Yeah, I think
No.
when I got to the last part of the poem, I was obviously kind of recognizing an ending here.
yeah. And rivers, they're seem so prominent in your writing.
Yeah, I've always loved rivers. I think we lived near a river, have done for a long time, and so there's that element there. And I remember writing a poem with Stan Dragland about walking to Bell Rock, which was in a much earlier book. And so it was kind of interesting to come back to the river in this one as well. Yeah.
Well, the river is right there, and throughout Wallite, right?
Yes, that's right. All those
prominent there.
slightly corrupt rivers in England.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so then Dark Garden and Two Photos, they're based on a very different kind of memory loss. The memories that you don't have and the memories that you wish you had.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's kind of fascinating if you could talk about the effect of those photographs on you.
Well, I think I pretty well say that in the poem. You know, I mean, it's a very odd thing. First of all, in the first poem, to talk about something that where you were not there, but someone having told you an incident in their life, and in the second one, you know, it's not quite sure how to articulate that except through the poem. You know, it kind of, you're looking at a certain time of a much earlier time when someone was just a bride, and then you're looking at it later on, and so the different stages of the relationship, the husband, the ex-husband, all those things, that moves a poem forward in terms of time. And then yourself turning up a bit late, you know.
And Wanderer, you know, I'm curious about how that the opening two stanzas are quite unrelated, it seems, to the account of the Wanderer, and sort of wondering how that is. Are you talking about the way memory works there, sort of associative connections? And
that was a very odd one, because I mean, I think it began as this kind of slightly comic self-criticism of the speaker, and then a friend of mine was talking to me about this incident during the war in Poland, a Polish family, and so that comes in, and then that takes over the plot. Now, I need to, in some odd way, get out of the poem, and I had to come back through the dog, and you know, a sense of still waiting for the future to happen, which is happening in a lot of the poems here.
yeah, you do talk about escape in the. Isn't there escape in that? Escape from. Hang on. You actually have a few places of the
In
coin.
that poem?
Well, in that one, there's the. Yeah.
Well, the escape from Europe.
Yeah, but then there's the escape from a small tunnel of escape for forgiveness.
Yes, yes, yes.
And
I think there it's kind of referring in the first part to the comments about the speaker, but then it kind of becomes the other escape.
Switches into the other. Okay. So you know, it just does a switch that is a private kind of connection for you. Yeah. And then the billiard hall and the memories, they're a little like the lines saved in your pocket.
Yes, it was. Well, I mean, again, this wasn't planned, but it became planned in the rewriting. I think, you know, what does this hold here at all, or not? But I'm not trying to be evasive, but I'm not quite sure. I mean, that one and the next one was all fragments of a story. You know, I would write, say, 15 incidents and then try and merge them and make a kind of sense out of them. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you know, that poem and the billiard hall poem is the one with the lists of the various musicians and the picnics.
Right.
And so on, and it seemed like a very recognizable form to me, recognizable from Running in the Family, where there are quite a number of list poems. There's the Sweet Like a Crow list poem, and in The English Patient, it had me thinking of the page and a half, virtually, of a list of different types of desert winds.
Yes.
Yeah. And you know, it's amazing how often I see that referred to as people's favorite part of the novel. But it's a risky kind of form just to kind of line up these items one after the other.
Maybe I shouldn't do that too often.
No, you should.
I mean, I don't remember doing it in that earlier book, but I mean, obviously this is a trademark or something.
I think it's highly successful. Yeah, so, the whole collection has the feel, to me, of a writer's life, a writer's autobiography. Slipped in among these poems are many echoes of your other books. Dark Garden, of course, has the brief appearance of the collected works of Billy the Kid. Running in the Family crops up here and there.
Yeah.
Annel's Ghost. Warlight definitely shows up at the start of Estuaries.
Yes.
And so on. And also the poems are full of the authors and lines that you love. You freely acknowledge your attachments to them, your debts to them. You pay tribute to so many writers, to a lifetime of reading. And your head is full of the words of other writers. And I'm curious about how you compiled the collection. Did you have in mind a writer's life?
No, not at all. No,
yeah.
actually, probably I probably would have avoided that if I thought that was it.
Right.
But no, I mean, I think you write what you recognize what you love, in various works you read or paintings you see, and a lot of it was. I mean, it feels very autobiographical. There's a poem called what's it called, the Geography Sixth, which is a school. After going to a horrific school in Sri Lanka, I went to a not quite as horrific school in England, and I wanted to write about the Geography Sixth because in the last year of your school days, if you were very good at math, you were in the Math Sixth or the Latin Sixth or something like that. And if you were no good at anything, you were put in the Geography Sixth. And I met someone just recently who had gone to the same school, and he said, but at least you weren't in the Geography Sixth B, which is even worse, And so that was a complete pleasure of making a list and making a kind of autobiography of that incident in my life, So it's odd. I can't remember what the question was now.
Yeah, well, so, it was like how you compiled the collection, because you were obviously selecting from a number of poems.
Yeah.
Right, and so my question was, were you compiling a writer's life?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I think I recognized that quite late in the game,
Okay.
that it was also about writers and, and landscapes, and something as simple as a lock that becomes a kind of centerpiece in a way in the book. Yeah.
I've heard you say that there are elements of yourself hidden in the characters of your novels.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly Michael in The Cat's Table is easily identifiable. But you're not all that easy to find in the novels. But the poem is the traditional home of the self.
Yeah.
And often tediously so.
Mm-hmm.
And of course much experiment with lyric poetry has looked for ways to remove the presence of the author.
Mm-hmm.
And only a very small proportion of the poems in the collection use the first person pronoun I. And I'm curious about how you manage the line between too much of yourself and some of yourself.
I'm not sure how I did this. I'm not being evasive, but I'm not quite sure how I did this. It wasn't a plotted book to be a series of poems about the self. But I mean, what interests you at this age is what happened to you in the past that altered your life completely. Yeah, it's difficult to know. I mean, I just hadn't planned it. I mean, really, this was the book I wrote after spending about 20 years on novels, and when I finished Warlight, which I was very fond of, I didn't think I could write a novel like that again, and I needed to find another voice. And I think the voice was the most important thing to find, that I could, speak almost casually in a poem whereas a novel is more formal, you know, and planned. So here you've got, you know, a page and a half or a page for a poem, and you make something that, after editing and tightening it or changing it constantly over several months, you know, becomes a part of yourself that, you know, that didn't necessarily come from notes or anything like that. I didn't really make any notes to write this book. I would begin the book and then begin a poem and then see if it could go anywhere.
Yeah, I'm thinking more of the way you represent yourself in the poems, and it seems to me that you find all kinds of ways to avoid using the first person pronoun.
Yeah.
And so there's quite a lot of reference to yourself as you, or as he, or as we, and then there are many poems that have no pronouns at all. But I particularly turned to this idea because in the Geography 6th, you make the statement that Stendhal owned 350 pseudonyms, for he disliked the first person pronoun.
Yeah,
and
perfect,
I thought,
perfect.
you know, surely you would collect that fact.
Yeah. Thank God you found that passage. I can justify all of this now. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just had that there. It's such a funny line. I mean, who else would start listing those things, you know?
I think you're not aware of how much you dodge referring to yourself in these poems.
Yeah. It wasn't a plan to make it, a huge autobiography or anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, for a private poet, the poems aren't exactly shy about memories of love and desire.
Mm-hmm.
There are plenty of accounts of amazing realized loves that might have happened, imagined loves, the love that others had or didn't have. And you read from that wonderful Bulgarian poem, and that section where you hear the great collection of statements about missed love, most of them. And so did you really encounter such a radio station in Bulgaria that was in English and so on?
We went into this place in Bulgaria, and there was a radio there, and somewhere I took a photograph of this radio. It was very beautiful, but very small, and they were speaking not in English, I'm afraid. The poem began as, a bit similar to some of the other poems about, meeting someone and nothing happens, and then that becomes the overall plot, and the whole prose poem ends with that relationship again coming up in the last paragraph or so. But and then just giving examples of people who were turned away when they needn't have been turned away or something like that. It's not a profound poem about that, but it became a kind of list. This is more of a thing where I had no idea where this poem was going, and so I was trying to find examples of people in that kind of situation where things did not work. So I think that was what was happening.
One other way that it seems to me you remove yourself from the poems is you give a lot of agency to language, and you allow language to take you into places you didn't quite anticipate. And I'm thinking of the poem Definition, where you follow the lead of the dictionary.
Right.
And so, the Sanskrit dictionary, was it, I presume, a Sanskrit-English dictionary?
Yes, luckily.
Right.
And it's still a huge thing, I have. And it not that much comes, in fact, from the dictionary. I mean, the professions, that are there, I mean, I think they don't come from that. at all. I mean, the only one I like is the guy who's become a morose guy who had once invented a prayer. It was a rather sweet story, but but I mean, that was a kind of thing that did allow me to go imagine a situation, as many of the poems, in fact, come out of that imagining of a situation of someone taking a bath or whatever it is, so someone 25 years earlier stepping on a nail. So the self goes and abides or lives with that person.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of references in the poems to translation, to things that are translated, and I wonder if you've ever translated.
No. We never translated?
We translated. Well, okay, so the reason I ask this is that I have seen a copy of the poem that Robin Blazer wrote, dedicated to you, An Iceberg, the Iceberg, and in between the lines you have translated the poem into Sinhala.
Yeah. That was a little game I was playing. Did you get that from Pierre Coupé? It was supposed to be a secret thing.
It's in the Capilano Review archives.
Oh. I'll probably get sued by the Blazer family or whatever it is. No, I was just, again, this was the perverse enjoyment of taking something and turning it into something. But there was no translation at all, I'm afraid.
Okay.
He dedicated to me because I just said to him once, I just love this poem. And I was very honored,
The fundamental ground of your writing life has been Sri Lanka, country of your birth and first 11 years, and then I gather you've returned frequently.
Yeah.
And Sri Lanka is certainly a presence in this collection. Can you talk about the Sri Lankan
connection,
content, and the connection?
Yeah, I guess several books. I mean, not Warlight, but the handwriting had many poems set in Sri Lanka, as well as being love poems. And then I think the book that in some odd way links up with this is the one where he's on a ship, The Cat's Table. Because in that book, he begins at the age of 9 or 11 or something like that. He begins as an 11-year-old. And then as the book goes on, he will leap to when he's 30 years old or 40 years old, and then he'll come back to the boy of 11 years old at the end. And I think all the varieties of time and age in him has a kind of connection with this book. Structurally, I think it's very close to this.
And Winchester House, can you talk about that?
Winchester House is a school I went to that was worse than the school in England. And it was I wrote about it in earlier books. I think it's in Anil's Ghost, it's there, and I think in maybe even the very early ones, Running the Family. It's a school I was at from the ages of 8, 9, 10, and possibly 11. And it was, in retrospect, a savage school. It was a priest who kind of beat most of the students who were about average age of 7 or 8. And in the earlier books, it became a kind of war between the students and this Father Barnabas, who gets referred to in the earlier books. And then by the time I wrote this one in terms of the middle of a book of poems, I was finding out more stuff about this man, who was actually a brute. So I mean, I don't want to advertise this element in the book and make you go and enjoy it or anything like that. But it's interesting to me because some of the people in this book, one boy named Skanda, who was a friend of mine at school, I had already turned him into an interesting doctor in Anil's Ghost. And so suddenly I started to write this thing, and I realized that the Skanda character had given me a photograph of a cricket match. And so I had to start reinterpreting him. And actually, if I can just read one little bit in here, because I think it became very interesting to do this, going back to a character who had already written about. Sorry.
Maybe I'll add that the interesting fact there was that you had already written Anil's Ghost and fictionalized this school friend.
Yes, Skanda.
And then only after writing Anil's Ghost did he provide the photograph.
Right, right. Or he may not have provided the photograph, but I think he did. I'll just read two little bits. And so there's a group of doctors in this story, in Anil's Ghost. This group of doctors realized it was a time that would alter their lives. They would learn everything of value here. Not one of them returned later into the economically sensible careers of private practice. They woke and walked barefoot in sarongs at dawn onto a narrow country road, half awake, half smiling for no reason in this new yet still ancient universe, as if lords of another time, unsafe, honorable somehow. It was during these pages in the book, when Skanda is among the other doctors, that I could always somehow relax. So I'm now writing here, remembering writing that part of the book. That I could always somehow relax, just remain curious about what was happening, about the discoveries of their character. It was strange, for the book was full of biographical and autobiographical intimacies, and yet I was at ease. It was that further intimacy that comes with trusting a fiction, a non-personal truth, going towards what you do not yet know. You will not even remember writing it. And actually, that was probably the moment I think I was most startled by writing this kind of stuff. Even writing about meeting someone who hadn't known yet, but seeing it there. And in fact, the quotes from Anil's Ghost are totally incorrect, because I was using it in a different kind of way. It's not faithful to Anil's Ghost. But essentially, that was the situation there, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, the novel and the poem couldn't be more different in their form and content, and yet you bridge the gulf. The boundaries between prose and poetry seem very porous in your hands. In fact, I can't think of another writer who has so thoroughly merged poetry and prose. How consciously do you keep the options open to yourself as you're writing?
Well, I had no idea I was going to have prose in this book. I kind of was going to try and write a book of poetry. So, but then so going back to Winchester House brought me there, and then allowed me to kind of drag in Skanda again in another role, so that was very interesting. But I hadn't planned that at all,
But even in a poem like the Bulgarian radio station poem,
yeah.
that is, most of it is in
Prose,
poetry,
right.
and then there's 2 pages or 3 pages of prose.
Yeah.
So that kind of slide into prose, how does that transition happen?
I'm not sure it's justified, but I was. If you're talking about Bulgaria, you need to kind of change form, I think. And I was there for 3 weeks doing something there. So I was being led by this friend who was writing something about that. I think the thing, what always interests me is finding a voice, I think, finding a voice that allows you to kind of change. the pleasure of writing, working on a novel and then saying, okay, I'm going to try and write poetry now this is a possible gift of finding a new voice.
Mm-hmm.
When I was running in the family many years ago, I was trying to write about my grandmother, who was a sort of a central, exaggerated character in some way. And I just didn't know. I mean, I would hear stories about her, but nothing was coming to me. And then, I've told this story before, I was at a party and a wonderful woman who was about 85, Fadet Midenia, who's an actress. And she said, I hear you want to write about your grandmother. I said, yeah, but it's impossible. And she said, just listen to me. I'll tell you exactly how she spoke. And she just talked to me for about 10 minutes, with great exaggerations, never play cards for money, never, do all these 35 rules she had to become an impossible person. And it just opened the book up. The whole next section of the book allowed me to have her do anything because that voice was in me. Mm. And that voice was in me with English Patient after about 100 pages, who he hadn't spoken at all. And then suddenly he started speaking because he was allowed to speak, So I think that kind of thing, getting a voice, and maybe that's what I needed to find in this book when I went back to Bulgaria.
Yeah, so the voice in prose is different from the voice in poetry.
Yeah, it's more intricate, maybe.
Which one?
The voice in prose. Because I think, maybe I'm completely wrong, the pleasure of writing prose is that it allows you the next voice and the next voice, next scene and the next scene. Mm. So something like Anna in Divisadero, who has a specific tense first section of the book, where she cannot get over what's happened, then goes to France, and then she meets this guy playing a guitar. I didn't know who these people were even when I was writing the first section. Mm-hmm. And so it allowed you to kind of then discover who she met for the rest of her life and who she fell in love with later on. And I find that a real pleasure in prose, whereas the real pleasure in poetry is, getting something really tight, if you can, and I'm not quite sure what it is, but I prefer actually writing poetry now, but I think it's the tightness of it that is a pleasure. Whereas in prose, you can wander off and join the Foreign Legion or something,
Right. Yeah, well, there's, I have a sense with the poems that they're all kind of leaning towards novels. The character in The Wanderer, the German deserter, I thought, oh, there's a character for a novel.
Yeah.
But so many of these poems refer to stories.
Yeah.
There's, the storyline, the story's unresolved, the collection of poetry that you published before this one was called The Story. It seems to me there's a kind of tease going on here.
A tease?
A tease,
oh.
Yeah. You're teasing us with these poems that are kind of leaning towards being stories. I don't know, I think of the last interview that wonderful Eleanor did with you. She was talking about The Cinnamon Peeler's Wife, that poem, and she said, what's the story behind that?
Mm-hmm, yeah. Well, you know what? Essentially, I talked to a guy I was trying to find out some other information, and about charms, and I was taping this conversation, and it was just fascinating, how you find out charms or stop charms happening. And I went home, turned on the tape recorder, and there was nothing on it. And it was just absolutely nothing on it. And I was slightly pissed off. And then I wrote The Cinnamon Peeler, like 10 minutes later, and this was not part of the plan for the day, certainly. So that was lucky,
That was the charm maker, I
Yeah,
think.
the charm maker was giving him a little gift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So hybrid poet novelists are not really all that common out
No.
there. There certainly aren't that many who are successful and celebrated in both genres.
Yeah.
There's Thomas Hardy, of course, D.H. Lawrence, Gertrude
Yeah.
Stein. Hardy quit novels altogether and wrote only poetry. Lawrence and Stein went back and forth through their careers. J.M. Coetzee began as a poet and then gave up
Yes.
poetry and
Yeah.
was all fiction.
And he writes a lot of book reviews of poetry
Oh, right.
in all languages. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very interesting.
But what has struck me is that working in the two genres is not at all unusual for Canadian writers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And there are a remarkable
Yeah.
number of them. Daphne
Mhm.
Marlatt, George Bowring, Margaret Atwood, Roy Kiyuka,
Yeah,
Nicole
yeah.
Brassard, Dion
Yeah,
Brand,
Yeah.
Lisa Robertson.
Dorothy Livesey, way back.
Way back,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Lisa Robertson
Yeah.
recently.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any understanding of this Canadian phenomenon?
Well, I mean, I'm very impressed by the amphibious quality of the trade. More, you said, much more so here. But even Raymond Carver, who's lauded as a great short story writer, I find his poetry much more interesting. I mean, not all of them because he wrote hundreds, but there's some wonderful poems by him that I would never have stumbled on. And did so only in the last 10 years, I think, yeah.
But I think if he'd been a Canadian, we would have known about his poetry.
Well, he's pretty well known for his poetry, but, it's, oops, I've got a question.
Oh, thanks. Okay.
But, talking about the Canadians, we were talking earlier on about poets from Vancouver as well as from Toronto, and I was saying that in many ways, Coach's Press, which I was involved with in terms of being published by in the first place, and also being an editor there, was what allowed me to link up with many of the poets on the West Coast, like George and Daphne and Sharon Thiessen and lots of poets here.
Robin Blazer, yeah.
And through that, then going south to American poets in the Southwest. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to skip to one last question. And it's really a question about your art and artistry, which I feel that you kind of play down, have played down in the interview.
Oh, really?
But I think you do that. And yeah, I'm in awe of these poems and the kind of spell that they create, and you get language to resonate and stir the spirit, and how do you do it?
Yeah.
How do you know when to stop? And maybe it's an editing question.
I think it is an editing question. I think I am a compulsive editor. I've always loved editing. And, even a novel, even if it's 300 pages or 400 pages, it'll go through about 10 drafts. First in pen, and then typed, and then change and change and change. And with poems, you are really, hanging around this one 12-line poem for, 2 or 3 weeks and then come back to it later on. So there's the real pleasure in some ways in writing is finessing something or make it less finessed, perhaps, in a way, I think.
Well, there are quite a number of references in these poems to craft. And without without a doubt, there's plenty of craft on show here. And I just want to read this line, this sentence from Gillian Rose's book called Love's Work, which I feel really kind of nails what you do. She says, writing is that mix of discipline and miracle, which leaves you in control, even when what appears on the page has emerged from regions beyond your control.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's you.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we'll take some questions from the audience.
This is the difficult part.
Are there some questions? Yes.
I'm going to stand up in the back here. Firstly, thank you so much. It's beautiful. You moved around the book and read in different sections. Is it your wish or desire when I get my book, or we all get our books, for us to read from page 1 through, or is it all right to push through and read it in different places?
Definitely page 1 to the end. A lot of care was taken.
I think I should repeat the question so that everyone could hear. Is it your preference that readers of your book should start from page 1 and work their way to the end?
That's why they were numbered that way. You know.
I haven't seen the book, but there I have it.
What? Oh, okay. Okay. Next question.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for this beautiful collection. In it, you reference a lot of these really canonical writers, Beckett, Proust, and I'm wondering if I can ask you to be in the present and ask you who is writing today, who's publishing today that you are most excited about?
Okay, I'll repeat that.
This
So
is the killer
question is, who is writing today who you feel most impressed by?
Every name is gone from my head. No, I do this thing. It's a compulsive thing. I probably had 20 names ready to tell you later on or before this, but it's tough to remember. I think what was happening to me in the last 3 or 4 years was found it very difficult to read novels, because they seem to be moving very slowly. The first 20 pages, very interesting. Page 200, same situation, really. I'm sorry being a bit stupid here, but I was much more ready to read poems that were emerging and swerving away and swerving back and with a surprise. So unless it was something non-fictional, it was a desire for that. But I'm sorry, I can't think of too many names right at the top of my head. I mean, liking Raymond Carver's poetry, for instance. I do like that, and many others. Yeah, Philip Levine I like. So I'm going back to earlier writers, as opposed to the contemporaries. Which is.
There are 2 questions from the online audience. You said that you rewrite poems several times so that they become more natural. Could you expand on that?
No, it's not that they become more natural, but that they're kind of taught, T-A-U-T, that kind of taught, and they're also surprised, and then they. I mean, the poem about the Sanskrit dictionary, that was a very interesting one for me to write, because I had no idea what it was even going to be about, apart from the Sanskrit dictionary. And as I was writing it, I thought, well, this is going to go somewhere. And then, I thought the professions would be interesting, but went somewhere else. And so you get to the end, and you are utterly surprised by the whole last movement of that poem, which I had no idea I was even going towards. So it's like Creedy saying, if if you've got a great last line for a poem, you take it out and make it the first line, because if you know where the last line is going, then everybody else will know. So I mean, that was that kind of, that was interesting to me to hear that a long time ago.
And another question, our relationship with memory is changing in this era of social media, with instant recall and obsession with documenting our lives. How do you think this shift could impact poetry and art?
Could be dangerous. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. Sorry. Yes, so.
You.
I'm just curious, do you tend to finish a work and take a little break and then start something else? Or do you always have something on the go?
Well, a book of poems, I'm usually working on the poem endlessly. And I might be working on some other poem, then I might come back to this. I mean, this literally took about 3 years to write. So, I mean, I don't know when the 35 poems, or whatever they were assumed to be finished, but then I would always go back until the very, very end. Even in the, when the book was being printed, I would say, I have a few more mistakes, to change. And I usually drive them crazy, And this was something that was very, very important to me, from the very beginning. And I mean, Daphne and I were both working on somewhat similar situations about our families years ago for the Capilano Review. And, we were changing things all the time, and I'd be looking over her shoulder and then using something or something like that. Yeah, no, it's always that process of rediscovering what could be better, or tighter or more suggestive, I think, is always very important.
I was kind of thinking of this book as a project, though, and not the individual poems, which I completely understand what you're saying. But when you finished the book, did you take a pause and kind of reinvigorate yourself in some way? Or do you instantly start something else?
I have never started something else instantly. And I don't have any plan for that at the moment, yeah. No, you really are. I was really rewriting this book even 2 months ago, trying to persuade the publisher to change something. Sorry.
Okay, was there one more? Okay.
How has your sense of home changed or remained the same over the course of your life? How has your sense of home changed or remained the same over the course of your life?
Yeah, I think it's always changing, And I don't think I could write a poem that I wrote 5 years ago now. I could like a poem or hesitate about that poem, but it'll have to be something new,
You heard poem and I said home.
What did you say?
Home. House. Home.
Poem.
A what?
What? I hear poem.
Home. Oh, this is a book about home.
I was asking a broad question. How has your sense of home changed over the course of your life?
Probably constantly. Yeah. Should I read that last poem?
I think now's a good time.
Okay.
Yeah. Michael will end the occasion with this last poem. The last poem in the book for those who are going to read from page 1 through to the end.
Okay. Talking in a river. For years we have talked like this in a river, after months away, how we missed each other, what we discovered or argued over when apart, our stories stitched together the lost winter, and what occurred in February when this river froze, having been abandoned by us. We are in this usual gathering place, telling stories that always begin a certain way, recalling a possibly altered life, as if within the wide liberty of a novel, where you might trespass into a field during a first chapter, or board a crowded train and claim this is where you fell in love. It is how a person might reveal a desire among friends with no foothold in this river, only a cloud's reflection holding you up. Each afternoon, the 4 or 5 of us break into song. Chuck Berry's Memphis, Tennessee, Zevon's A Certain Girl, remembered from an earlier time when none of us knew each other, when that storm of music had not yet arrived. Now we are with each other's children, where there might be a sudden embrace over a sadness, someone's loss. But on certain nights, the river will rise because of a released or altered lock, a mile north of here. And the canoe that rests on rock will rise with the water and float away untethered. You go after it. You swim downstream with a paddle to reach it, steer it back. You journey beyond the familiar properties, find yourself before long in anonymous water, nothing audible from shore, only the shake of reflection like a breaking word. Is this a different mood of the Black River? With daylight, there is the disguised location of the stars. You recall other journeys where you crisscrossed Lanark or Frontenac County from river to river and entered the scuttle holes of the Moira to swim its maze of underwater rock you shall never see again. There were so many streams with abandoned names, their riverbeds wordless. Whereas elsewhere, rivers even describe themselves, the wide Missouri, the Qu'Appelle, who floats, who calls. You swim into late afternoon, the past more distant, more alive. One late spring you sensed your way east, portaging over fields as if through a post-war landscape. You forget that river's name you came to, where you beached the borrowed canoe, entered a cafe and danced with her for an hour beside a jukebox, faithless, near that small river whose creeks had merged, disguising themselves with another river's story. He remembers her there, by that nameless river, long after, still envious of himself at that time. All those echoing rivers we are lost, or where we lost or found ourselves. Who calls? Who calls? There was a girl by the Clare River, he remembers now, as he swims into evening with the arrival of those stars. Thank you.
Should we retreat?
Huh?